about you, but this concept of being able to count things has really inspired me. I've been thinking about starting an exercise regimen, and like a good programmer, I know I need an application before I can even think about doing something like that. So I updated this application a bit to allow us to do a couple things by adding routing. I added in the app routing module a couple routes. One is single and one is list. Single is the stuff we did before in this series, and list will be the stuff we add now. That single component here looks like this. It just has our counter component, nothing in the TypeScript, just our counter component and our count by. And in our app component HTML, I added a router outlet and a few links so we can go from just keeping track of a single thing to a list of things, which is what I want to show now. In the app module, I added our app routing module and the reactive forms module. We'll do a tiny little form to allow us to add new things to our list. In counters and counters HTML, which is currently empty, this is where I'm going to create a little form to let us add something to our list. I'll call it a section entry. That way, if I want to style this differently later, I can. And then just a little HTML form. All the classes I'm adding to things here come from the Bootstrap library. So if you don't use that, you can just bracket that off, just ignore that. So all we're going to ask for is a name for this new counter. Add a submit button. And a place to show our list. I don't know what that's going to look like, so I'll just put a little placeholder here. Looks good. I probably need to add a little styling to that button. If I'm really going to be motivated to exercise, it better look good. Much better. So we'll add some Angular form stuff here. I'm going to add the form builder, ask for the form builder from the services, and then create my form by saying this is going to be a form group with one item, which is name, and it'll be empty by default. We won't do any validation or anything right now. I'll add a submit method. And this is where we'll dispatch an action. Update the form so it knows about the reactive form stuff. Set the form group to the name of the form group on my TypeScript class and tell it what to do when this form is submitted. Associate that input with the name form field. And we're ready to go. So we're going to need an action to dispatch here. And this is going to require a whole new reducer. So I'm going to add to our reducers folder a new reducer that will keep track of our list of things. So we'll call this counter list reducer.ts. And if I think through this a little bit, what we're going to add on this thing, it might make sense to think that we should set up our state just to hold an array of counters, and something that might look a little bit like this. So our application state in this portion would be an array. It would contain elements that are each counters with a current and what they want to count by, if we're going to let them change what they count by on individual counters. We need a way to distinguish those so we could add an ID to the thing. Each one could get some kind of unique ID. And so we can differentiate them in the list. We might want to give them some kind of description or name. So I'm going to add a name property to each one of these things. And that's that's the intuitive look on this, work on this. Um, However, keeping arrays of things immutable, so that you don't change them when you need to update things, things like that, takes quite a bit of code. So people have been doing Redux even before we Angular people crawled out of our cave and noticed this pattern, had come up with ways to store immutable lists of things in memory. And the structure they came up with kind of looks like this. You create a little index property called IDs that has an entry with the ID of each one of the elements in the list. And then the entities themselves are an object map where the ID maps to the element. And this makes it much easier to work with. So much so that the people at NGRX created a little helper library that I'm installing now called NGRX Entity. It promotes you storing your state this way. And in the deal, they give you some handy code that does all the heavy lifting for you, mostly in the shape of this thing called an adapter. So I'm going to import from NGRX Entity two things. I'm going to import a kind of normative thing called entity state that says how we're going to store our entities, and then a little utility function called create entity adapter that creates us a power tool that lets us add things, remove things, updates, etc. So the items stored in this branch of the state are going to have an ID and a name. And then the rest of the stuff, I can just go extend the counter state thing. Remember, the counter state already has by and current. You know, I could have redeclared those here. There's no need to do that, but I'm lazy. It saved me a bit of time. So that's the thing that's going to be stored in our state, in the list of things in our state. And then NGRX Entity says export an interface that describes the overall state using this entity state of what the elements actually are going to be, which ours are going to be these counter entities. And then in those curly braces there, if there's any state stuff that you would want to add other than the IDs or the entities, you can put it there. We won't have anything right now. And when you create your initial state, you need something with empty IDs and an empty entities object. And with NGRX Entity, you don't even need to type that. This adapter will be able to do it for you. So I'm going to create this adapter. We're going to export it because we'll use it in our root reducer in the index.ts later. And this little function, you tell it what kind of entities you're working with. And then it can do things for you like give you a good empty initial state. And now I can create my reducer functions. I'm going to use the create reducer method from NGRX store, give it the initial state, and then create my exported name function. That takes the initial state, or the state, and an action, and returns the state. And I'll just delegate to my create reducer function here. Now to add that to my application state, I'm going to go to index.ts, import that as from counters. It's only one letter off from the other one, so I'm going to make it a little less likely to get me in trouble here. And we're going to call that counters list, and that's going to look like the counter state. And then we'll have to add a corresponding property on our reducers that refers to the counters reducer that will handle that branch of the state. And at this point, we should be able to look in our dev tools, Redux, look at the state, and there it is. We have two branches now, count and counter list. And that's going to look just like that as we fill it up with some data. So now we can create the actions. I'm going to create a new actions file. We'll call it counterslist.actions.ts. Import our create action. And little props helper. This action is going to be a little more involved than the actions we've done previously because we're going to have to actually calculate some values that will be part of this. Our goal here is to have this action have data that is suitable for adding to the state. So it's going to have a counters entity attached to it. So in this example, I'm actually going to use a function instead of the props thing. And I'm going to say, well, what are they going to have to give me from that form? They're going to give me a name, and that name is going to be a string. And with that, I'm going to return a new object with a payload property that is a counter entity. And a counter entity needs an ID. So I'm going to take that little ID variable and increment it, post increment, and turn it to a string. I have the name. I'm going to set by 1 and current to 0. And that is what we need to be able to add that thing to the state. While I'm in here, I might as well add the increment and decrement. So increment list counter, these will just be actions with properties. And the property will be the counter entity that we want to either increment or decrement. The next one's going to look just like this. So I'm going to do a little copy and paste and rename, and that almost always works against me. Screws something up. So be super careful. Make sure you change not only the name of the function that it creates, but the type. And notice in both of those places, I have a common typo. We'll let it ride. Okay, so now back on our counter component.ts, I'm going to get a reference to the store and my actions. Inject the store into the component. Read the name out of the form. And dispatch our new action with that name. Let's check out the dev tools and see how I did. Looks good. So there's one with 1 ID. Look at that payload, just perfect for adding to our state. I'm going to add another one here. Lunges, make sure the ID increments properly, right? So I'm just generating those IDs so everything's uniquely identifiable. An object with an ID stored in a list is known as an entity. Back in our reducer, then we have enough information to add that to our state. So I'm going to import the little on helper and our set of actions. And then update our create reducer to say when we add a counter to the list, given the state and the action, I'm going to use this adapter to add one item to the list, which is the payload, to the state. and that will update both the ID's property of the state and the entity's property of the state in a mutable way. There won't be any changes. A new state will be created that has the ID and the entity. And if I add another one, now there's 2 IDs and 2 entities in that map. There's 1 and there's 2. I think we're ready to do the list. So in index.ts, I'm going to add another selector that gets me to that new branch of data, the counters list. Just like we did with getting to the count, this will give us the part of the application state that holds that list. And then a really cool feature of the adapter that's part of NGRX entity is that it will give you some common selectors that you might need. So we use that adapter, get selectors, give it the branch where that state lives, and it returns an object with 4 different methods on it. Select all, select entities, select IDs, and total. Select entities is a reference to the entities, select total is the number of elements there, and select IDs is a reference to that array of IDs. So I just need select all, and I'm going to export that as select all list counters by using object destructuring. Lets me do it in one nice line of code with one call, and there's place there if I ever want to pull anything else out. So back on our component, I'm going to create my observable. This time it's going to return an array of counters entities. Use that selector I just created. And maybe before we think about what this is going to look like, we'll just output it on the screen to make sure we're getting some data, a little debug thing here. So use the async pipe and tell it to convert it to JSON. And I just realized I should probably pluralize counters here because it is a list of counters. So I'll update my variables in my observable. And let's see what this looks like. So it's empty right now. There's nothing in it. If I add something, there's 1. That's what that portion of the state looks like now. It's an array, so it's enumerable. We can use it in an NG4. If I add another one, let's see if that gets pushed on the list. Yes, we have 2 things, and we can just make our list show each of those things. So let's get rid of that little debug pre-tag there and actually figure out what we want to go inside this list. Maybe I'll go over to getbootstrap.com, do a little shopping for something that looks nice. And I'm thinking maybe a card. I use those a lot. Yeah, that one looks pretty good. It's a little overkill. We won't use it all, but I'll take that HTML and use that as my starting basis. Copy that and back in our project, paste that in there. Get rid of some of the demo specific styling they added. And then for the card title, we're going to show the name of that. So we're going to repeat this card 1 time for each counter of our observable of counters. And again, once you get trained with that $ thing, you know you always add the async pipe. So here I'm going to show the counter's name. And then maybe in the subtitle here, I'll show what the current value is. So counter.current. Probably don't need anything else there. Those links are kind of nice, but I'll probably just add some buttons there to let us increment and decrement those. So let's see what this looks like. Nice. Good, good. So it's repeating that 1 time for each one. One thing I noticed is I have to click back into that form each time I type something new, and it's getting a little annoying. So I'm going to reset the form after each entry. I marked that input with a template variable called focus me, and I'm going to send that to the submit method. This is a little side hike. Take that as an input to the submit method, and after I reset the form, I can put the cursor there again so it's ready to add some new data, and it'll be a little more convenient to use it. So now notice when I type something in, add it, the cursor's back there, it's cleared out, ready to go, and I continue to come up with my exercise plan. Now it might be nice if I can increment and decrement those counters. Not sure why I'd want to decrement something I did, for exercise, but we'll add it in there. So a couple buttons. Let's see, we could do increment, decrement. Maybe I'll just put the words in there. Decrement. We'll make this one increment. See, I can spell decrement. I just can't do it consistently. Create our little methods that dispatch our actions. We're going to need a reference to that counter. There we go. And our increment method will look very much the same. Hook the buttons up. Pass the reference to the current counter in. Let's see how we did. Add a couple. And they're dispatching the actions, but our state isn't changing because we need to update our reducer. So back in the reducers file, our counters list reducer. What I need is, you can see the payload here has what they're counting by, what the current is, etc. But I need to update the state with that information. So the NGRX entity adapter has methods for doing all sorts of things, adding things, removing things. We're going to update something. So on the actions increment list counter, given the state and the action, I'm going to ask the adapter to update one item. So update one, and the first argument is what's called an update object, and the second is the state. The update object takes the ID of the thing you want to update, so that ID, and then what changes you want to make to that thing. And I'm going to change its current property to whatever the current is plus what they're counting by. And then the same thing for our decrement. So when we decrement, given the state and the action, I'm going to ask the adapter to update one entity with these changes, find the entity with this ID, and change the current value to whatever the payload's current value minus the payload's what they're counting by. And then the second argument is the state. Those changes, by the way, you can change any property, any number of them. So you can change multiples at the same time, et cetera, et cetera. You can see that in the interface for the changes. And now let's see how we did. Add a couple items, increment, and you can see they are independently incrementable and decrementable. Fantastic. Well, that was fun. And I think as soon as maybe I get a nap, I'm going to start this exercise program.